At the top of a quiet Virginia hill, Monticello still looks exactly the way Americans expect it to look. Balanced, elegant, enlightened. Red brick walls framed by white columns. A low dome rising above the trees like a thoughtful pause in the landscape. Tourists walk the path slowly, cameras in hand, absorbing the sense that this place represents something pure about the nation's beginnings. A home built by the author of the Declaration of Independence. A shrine to liberty, reason, and self-government. It feels timeless, settled, resolved. But Monticello was never just a house. It was a system. And like all systems, it had inputs, outputs, and costs that were carefully hidden from view. When Thomas Jefferson looked out from these windows, he did not see a monument. He saw an operation that had to function every day to support the life he believed a statesman should live. Monticello was designed to project refinement and order, but beneath its symmetry lay constant motion. Food had to be grown, harvested, processed, and cooked. Clothing had to be made and repaired. Wood cut, nails forged, furniture built, fields cleared, roads maintained. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened freely. The beauty visitors admire today was not inherited. It was manufactured, sustained by labor that was coerced, controlled, and rendered invisible by the time Monticello reached its finished form. It stood atop a workforce of enslaved men, women, and children whose lives were organized around Jefferson's comfort and ambition. They did not appear in portraits. Their names were rarely recorded with care. Yet they were everywhere, moving through the house's hidden corridors, working in the kitchens below the main floor, tending fields beyond the tree line, shaping the very bricks that defined Jefferson's vision of Republican virtue. Monticello functioned because they did. Without them, the house would have been an empty shell on a hill. What makes Monticello different from other plantations is not the absence of exploitation, but the presence of ideals. Jefferson wrote about liberty while managing bondage. He argued for independence while depending on human property. The tension between those two realities was not theoretical. It played out daily, in ledgers and schedules, in punishments and rewards, in a carefully maintained order that allowed one man to live as a philosopher while hundreds lived as assets. Monticello did not merely coexist with slavery. It depended on it, and yet for generations the story told here was incomplete. Visitors learned about architecture, innovation, intellect. They admired the clever skylights, the revolving doors, the precision of Jefferson's design. The labor that sustained it remained in the background, treated as context rather than cause. The wealth that powered Monticello was presented as abstract, as though it emerged naturally from land and genius alone. It did not. It was extracted, measured, and enforced. This story begins at the moment when Monticello appears most finished, most serene, most permanent. Because only then can we see what it truly was. Not a contradiction frozen in brick and mortar, but a functioning wealth system, engineered to convert human lives into stability, comfort, and legacy. To understand Monticello, we must look past the hilltop and into the machinery beneath it. Only then does the real story begin. Thomas Jefferson liked to imagine himself as a gentleman of reason, a man guided by intellect rather than impulse, by balance rather than excess. He cultivated this image carefully. He dressed plainly by the standards of European aristocracy, but surrounded himself with refinement. He spoke softly, avoided public confrontation, and presented his ambition as duty rather than desire. To his supporters, he was the embodiment of Republican virtue, educated but modest, powerful but restrained. Monticello was the physical expression of that self-conception. Every line of the house, every proportion, every carefully chosen vista reinforced the idea that its owner lived in harmony with nature, knowledge, and moral purpose. But this image, like the house itself, was constructed deliberately and maintained at great cost. Jefferson was born into privilege, but not into the kind of wealth that sustained itself effortlessly. His father, Peter Jefferson, left him land and enslaved laborers, but also expectations. In Virginia's planter society, status was not secured simply by ownership. It had to be performed. A gentleman was expected to host, to entertain, to educate himself broadly, to maintain a household that reflected cultivation and stability. Jefferson absorbed these expectations early, and once absorbed, he never questioned them. What he questioned instead was how to sustain that lifestyle without appearing to violate the principles he publicly espoused. From the beginning, his life would be defined by this tension. Jefferson's tastes were expansive and expensive. He loved books with a near-obsessive intensity, amassing one of the largest private libraries in America. He imported wine from France and Italy, tracked vintages meticulously, and insisted on quality even when his finances could not justify it. He filled Monticello with fine furniture, scientific instruments, clocks, and architectural features inspired by Europe's most refined traditions. He believed that a republic required educated leaders, and that education required immersion in beauty, science, and culture. In Jefferson's mind, these were not indulgences. They were necessities. The problem was that his income never matched his vision. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Jefferson was not a naturally disciplined manager of money. He disliked the mundane realities of accounting and delegation, preferring ideas to oversight. He trusted that the land would provide, that crops would sell, that debts could be rolled forward. Year after year, he spent in anticipation of income that rarely materialized as expected. Tobacco prices fluctuated. Soil exhaustion reduced yields. Weather ruined harvests. But Jefferson's spending habits remained steady, even as his debts quietly grew. Monticello, far from being a stable estate, was a constant work in progress architecturally and financially. This instability did not trouble Jefferson in the way it might trouble a modern observer. Debt, in the 18th century planter economy, was common and often seen as a temporary condition rather than a moral failing. Credit flowed easily to men of status. Lenders assumed that land and enslaved labor provided sufficient security. Jefferson borrowed against future harvests, against land he had not yet improved, and against people whose labor he did not pay. The system allowed him to live as though his wealth were permanent, even when it was not. Monticello appeared serene because the mechanisms that sustained it were invisible, abstracted into ledgers and promises. Jefferson's public career only intensified these pressures. Diplomatic service in France expanded his tastes and expectations dramatically. Exposure to European architecture, cuisine, and intellectual life deepened his conviction that refinement mattered. Returning to Virginia, he sought to recreate what he had admired abroad, not as imitation, but as proof that the American experiment could rival the old world. Monticello became his laboratory for this belief. But the costs of that experiment mounted steadily. Every improvement to the house, every imported item, every innovation added another layer of obligation beneath the surface. What Jefferson refused to do, consistently and deliberately, was simplify. He never seriously considered living within the limits of what Monticello could comfortably support. Nor did he abandon the social expectations of his class. Entertaining guests, hosting political allies, and maintaining appearances were not optional in Virginia society. To retreat from that role would have been to surrender status and influence. Jefferson believed that his ideas mattered too much for that. If the Republic required him to be a certain kind of man, then the system that sustained that man must continue, regardless of the cost. That system relied overwhelmingly on enslaved labor. Jefferson understood this, but he rarely confronted it directly. In his writings, slavery appears as an abstract evil, something regrettable, something inherited, something that history would eventually resolve. In practice, it was the foundation of his daily life. The men and women who worked his fields, built his furniture, cooked his meals, and raised his children's food were not temporary conveniences. They were the core workforce that allowed Jefferson to function as the man he believed himself to be. He managed them with the same detachment he applied to finances, delegating oversight while benefiting from results. Jefferson often spoke of independence as the highest political virtue. Yet his own independence was illusory. He depended on creditors who extended impatience, on merchants who shipped goods despite unpaid balances, and on enslaved people whose labor absorbed the shock of every financial miscalculation. When money was short, it was not Jefferson who went without. The system adjusted downward, quietly, invisibly. Rations were reduced. Work intensified. Lives were constrained further. The house on the hill remained composed, even as the pressure beneath it increased. This contradiction was not lost on Jefferson, but he compartmentalized it skillfully. He believed that the institution of slavery would eventually fade, that gradual emancipation might one day resolve the moral problem. In the meantime, he allowed himself to participate fully in a system he acknowledged as flawed. This ability to separate belief from behavior was not unique to Jefferson. It was common among Virginia's planter elite. What made Jefferson distinctive was the scale of his ideals and the precision with which he articulated them. Even as his private life undermined them, Monticello thus became a stage on which Jefferson performed a particular version of himself. To visitors, it suggested harmony, a thinker at peace with his environment, a statesman grounded in land and reason. To Jefferson, it represented aspiration, the life he believed was appropriate to his intellect and role in history. What it did not represent was security. Beneath the calm exterior lay constant anxiety about money, reputation, and legacy. Jefferson worried obsessively about how he would be remembered. Even as he avoided confronting the systems that made his life possible. By the time Jefferson reached the height of his political power, the gap between his image and his reality had grown wide. He was celebrated as a champion of liberty, while presiding over a plantation economy that denied liberty daily. He imagined himself as a steward of Republican simplicity while living in a house that required immense resources to maintain. Monticello did not resolve these contradictions. It concentrated them. It was both a refuge and a trap, binding Jefferson ever more tightly to the system he claimed to regret. Understanding Jefferson as an operator rather than a symbol does not diminish his historical importance. It clarifies it. He was not a hypocrite in the shallow sense of saying one thing and believing another. He believed deeply in his ideals. What he could not do was imagine a version of his life that did not depend on the exploitation of others. Monticello was the compromise he made with himself, a place where enlightenment principles could coexist uneasily with an economic reality he refused to dismantle. The house on the hill was not just Jefferson's home. It was the mechanism through which he reconciled who he was with who he wanted to be. Monticello's wealth system did not function through grand transactions or dramatic displays of power. It worked quietly, methodically, embedded in daily routines that turned human lives into economic units. By the time Jefferson inherited the plantation, slavery was already normalized as both labor system and social order in Virginia. What Jefferson added was efficiency, rationalization, and moral distance. He approached Monticello not only as a home or a farm, but as an experiment in management. Fields, workshops, gardens, and households were arranged to extract maximum productivity while maintaining the appearance of order and calm. The violence that sustained this system was not always visible, but it was constant. Unlike many planters who relied almost entirely on overseers, Jefferson involved himself deeply in the organization of labor. He kept meticulous records: births, deaths, work assignments, crop yields, clothing distributions. On paper, enslaved people became data points, their value calculated across decades. Children were assessed for future productivity. Women's fertility was tracked alongside agricultural output. Jefferson understood that enslaved labor was not just renewable, it was self-reproducing. This realization shaped Monticello's internal economy more than any philosophical reflection on liberty ever did. At the center of this system were families who lived under permanent surveillance. Enslaved people at Monticello did not simply work. They were managed from birth to death. Children as young as 10 were assigned tasks suited to their size, gradually trained into specialized roles. Some were sent to the nailery, an iron workshop Jefferson established beneath Monticello itself. There, boys worked long hours forging nails that could be sold for profit. Jefferson considered this an enlightened alternative to field labor, even as he acknowledged the work was punishing. Productivity was rewarded with marginal privileges. Failure was punished with whippings. Jefferson ordered but rarely witnessed. The Nailery reveals Jefferson's mindset with unsettling clarity. He believed that incentives and discipline could replace brute force, that enslaved people could be motivated through small rewards rather than terror alone. In theory, this reflected his belief in rational systems. In practice, he created a hierarchy of suffering. Those who met quotas might receive extra food or clothing. Those who did not faced physical punishment. Jefferson wrote calmly about this process, as though describing a machine that occasionally malfunctioned. The human cost was acknowledged only as an operational concern. Women bore a disproportionate burden within this system. They worked the fields, managed domestic labor, and were expected to bear children who would become future assets of the estate. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged the economic value of enslaved women's reproduction, but his records make it unmistakable. Children born into slavery at Monticello increased Jefferson's net worth automatically. They required no purchase, no negotiation. Their labor, once grown, would offset debts Jefferson continued to accumulate. This reality shaped every decision he made about discipline, housing. This reality shaped every decision he made about discipline, housing, and family structure among the enslaved population. The contradiction between Jefferson's public condemnation of slavery and his private dependence on it deepened as his finances worsened. Debt transformed enslaved people from laborers into collateral. They were mortgaged, appraised, and counted in estate valuations. When Jefferson borrowed money, lenders did not rely solely on land. They relied on people. Each enslaved man, woman, and child represented a future stream of labor that could be converted into cash if necessary. Jefferson understood this, even if he avoided acknowledging it in moral terms. His wealth was not liquid, but it was extractive. Monticello's layout itself reinforced this system of control. The main house sat atop the hill, commanding the landscape physically and symbolically. Below it lay Mulberry Row, a line of workshops, dwellings, and workspaces where enslaved people lived and labored. From Monticello's terraces, Jefferson could survey much of the operation without descending into it. Distance created detachment. The elegance of the house depended on the invisibility of the labor beneath it. Visitors saw gardens, vistas, and architecture. They did not see the full machinery that kept it functioning. Jefferson convinced himself that this arrangement was comparatively humane. He contrasted his management with the brutal plantations of the Caribbean, where mortality rates were catastrophic. At Monticello, he argued, enslaved people lived in family units, practiced trades, and avoided the worst excesses of violence. This comparison allowed him to claim moral distinction without challenging the foundation of the system. But relative kindness did not alter the fundamental reality. Every aspect of enslaved life was subordinated to Jefferson's needs. Ambitions and debts. Resistance existed, even if Jefferson rarely acknowledged it openly. Enslaved people ran away, stole food, slowed work, and defied orders in subtle ways. Jefferson recorded these incidents with frustration, interpreting them as discipline problems rather than expressions of agency. Each act of resistance threatened the efficiency of his carefully balanced system. The response was almost always increased control. Privileges were withdrawn. Punishments escalated. Trust, once broken, was rarely restored. The system could tolerate minor inefficiencies, but not challenges to authority. Jefferson's belief in gradual emancipation never translated into action at Monticello because emancipation threatened the entire economic structure he relied on. Freeing enslaved people would have required either radical downsizing or financial ruin. Jefferson was unwilling to accept either. Instead, he deferred responsibility to future generations, imagining that slavery would end through some unspecified historical process. This deferral was itself a form of control. By placing moral resolution perpetually in the future, he absolved himself of the need to act in the present. The intimacy of Monticello made these contradictions unavoidable. This was not a distant plantation managed entirely by others. Jefferson lived among the people he owned. He interacted with them daily. He relied on their skills, trusted them with his children, and depended on their loyalty. Yet the power imbalance remained absolute. Affection did not translate into freedom. Familiarity did not grant security. Any sense of stability enslaved families achieved existed at Jefferson's discretion and could be disrupted at any moment by sale, reassignment, or punishment. Nowhere is this more evident than in Jefferson's relationship with the Hemmings family. The Hemmingses occupied a unique position at Monticello, performing skilled labor and domestic work closely tied to Jefferson's household. Their proximity did not protect them from exploitation. It intensified it. Generations of the Hemmings family lived and worked under Jefferson's authority, their lives intertwined with his in ways that blurred personal and institutional boundaries. This closeness exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of Monticello's wealth system more starkly than any philosophical contradiction. Jefferson's ability to maintain this system rested on his capacity for compartmentalization. He separated ideas from implementation, ideals from economics. When writing about liberty, he spoke abstractly, universally. When managing Monticello, he acted pragmatically, locally. These two modes of thought rarely intersected. The result was a plantation that functioned efficiently while violating the very principles Jefferson claimed to champion. Monticello did not fail despite this contradiction. It survived because of it. The wealth generated at Monticello was never spectacular in the way of the largest plantations, but it was sufficient to sustain Jefferson's lifestyle for decades. That sustainability, however, came at the expense of those whose labor was never compensated and whose freedom was never recognized. The system worked precisely because it externalized its costs. Jefferson's debts were absorbed by enslaved bodies. His architectural experiments were financed by coerced labor. His intellectual pursuits were underwritten by lives denied education, autonomy, and choice thought by the time Jefferson reached old age. Monticello had become both a symbol of achievement and a ledger of unresolved moral debt. The plantation did not merely reflect the contradictions of early America. It operationalized them. Liberty existed as language. Slavery existed as practice. Wealth flowed upward. Suffering flowed downward. And the house on the hill stood serenely above it all. Its beauty inseparable from the system that sustained it. Understanding Monticello's wealth system requires abandoning the comforting illusion that history is shaped only by ideas. Ideas mattered to Jefferson, but systems mattered more. The forgotten wealth of Monticello was not gold or land alone. It was the accumulated value of generations of unpaid labor, disciplined into efficiency, justified by ideology, and hidden behind architecture. That is the secret Monticello was built to conceal, and the truth it can no longer fully contain. Debt was the silent architect of Monticello's later years. It shaped decisions, dictated compromises, and ultimately revealed the true cost of Jefferson's vision. While Monticello appeared stable to visitors and admirers, its financial foundation was eroding steadily beneath the surface. Jefferson's wealth system, already dependent on enslaved labor, became increasingly distorted as borrowing replaced income and promises replaced solvency. The plantation did not merely support Jefferson's lifestyle. It was mortgaged against it, piece by piece, until the future itself was spoken for. Jefferson's financial troubles were not sudden. They accumulated gradually through a lifetime of spending that exceeded earnings. Diplomatic service, political office, architectural experimentation, and constant improvement at Monticello all required funds that plantation agriculture could not reliably provide. Tobacco, once the backbone of Virginia wealth, was an unstable commodity. Soil exhaustion reduced yields year after year, while international markets fluctuated beyond Jefferson's control. Even diversification into wheat and other crops failed to generate the surplus he needed. Yet Jefferson continued to live as though stability were inevitable. Credit made this illusion possible. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, men of Jefferson's status could borrow extensively on reputation alone. His name carried weight, not only as a planter but as a statesman. Lenders assumed that land and enslaved labor would ultimately secure their investments. Jefferson borrowed to maintain Monticello, to educate his children and grandchildren, to acquire books and furnishings, and to sustain the social obligations of his class. Each loan deferred crisis while tightening the web of dependency around his estate as debts mounted. Enslaved people became increasingly central to Jefferson's financial calculations. They were no longer simply workers sustaining daily operations. They were assets whose market value underwrote Jefferson's credit. Account books reduced human lives to columns of figures. Age, skill, and physical condition were translated into monetary worth. Children, especially, represented future value, their potential labor extending decades ahead. Jefferson understood this arithmetic intimately. It allowed him to borrow more while convincing himself that solvency lay just beyond the horizon. The psychological burden of debt weighed heavily on Jefferson, though he rarely acknowledged it publicly. Privately, he expressed anxiety, frustration, and resentment towards circumstances he felt were beyond his control. He blamed falling crop prices, unfair creditors, and economic instability, but seldom questioned the structure of his own spending or the morality of treating human beings as financial instruments. Debt narrowed his moral imagination. As options disappeared, exploitation became not just convenient, but necessary. Jefferson's refusal to alter his lifestyle in response to financial reality is one of the most revealing aspects of his character. He could imagine a republic free from monarchy and aristocracy, but he could not imagine himself living without the comforts of a gentleman. Monticello had to remain a place of refinement, even as its costs became unsustainable. Entertaining guests, maintaining appearances, and continuing renovations were, to Jefferson, inseparable from his identity. The house was not merely shelter. It was proof of legitimacy. This commitment to appearance had consequences for those who lived below the surface of Monticello's elegance. As money tightened, enslaved people absorbed the strain. Workdays lengthened. Rations were cut. Clothing allowances were reduced. Privileges that once served as incentives were withdrawn. These adjustments were recorded in ledgers, not narratives, but their impact was profound. The plantation became more extractive precisely when Jefferson's ideals were most publicly celebrated. Debt also limited Jefferson's ability to act on his stated opposition to slavery. Emancipation, even gradual, would have required relinquishing valuable assets at a moment when he could least afford it. The enslaved population at Monticello was his primary source of financial security. Freeing them would have collapsed his credit and exposed his insolvency. In this way, debt did more than trap Jefferson economically. It trapped him morally. Every year of inaction reinforced the next. Jefferson's dependence on credit created a cycle that fed upon itself. Borrowing demanded collateral. Collateral demanded control. Control demanded discipline. Discipline demanded punishment. Each link in this chain tightened the system that sustained Monticello, while eroding the humanity of those within it. Jefferson may have believed that history would absolve him, that future generations would resolve the contradictions he could not. But his immediate choices had immediate victims. The political irony is striking. Jefferson helped design a nation built on resistance to economic bondage, yet lived his private life bound by debt. He warned against the dangers of financial dependency in public, even as he relied on it in practice. His suspicion of banks and centralized finance did not prevent him from using credit extensively. This dissonance was not accidental. It was structural. The early American economy allowed elites to decry debt while benefiting from it, so long as others bore the cost. As Jefferson aged, his financial situation became increasingly desperate. Inheritance obligations, family responsibilities, and declining productivity compounded his difficulties. He attempted various schemes to stabilize his finances, including selling land and negotiating with creditors, but these measures were insufficient. The plantation could not generate the surplus required to erase decades of accumulated debt. Monticello, for all its ingenuity and beauty, was economically unsound. Yet Jefferson clung to the belief that a final solution would emerge. He trusted in the eventual sale of Western lands, in delayed payments, in favorable market shifts. Hope replaced strategy. This optimism was not naive. It was necessary for psychological survival. To acknowledge the full extent of his financial failure would have required confronting the human cost embedded in his wealth system. Jefferson chose deferral instead. The consequences of this deferral would not be felt fully until after his death. Monticello's debts did not vanish with its creator. They passed to his heirs, transforming private anxiety into public reckoning. The people who had sustained Jefferson's life would be sold to satisfy obligations incurred in his name. Families would be separated. Lives would be uprooted. The elegant house would remain, but the community beneath it would be dismantled. Debt, in this sense, was the final expression of Monticello's forgotten wealth system. It exposed what had always been true, that Jefferson's vision was financed by borrowed time, borrowed money, and borrowed lives. The plantation did not fail because Jefferson lacked ideals. It failed because ideals were never allowed to disrupt the mechanisms that sustained his comfort and status. To understand Monticello's history is to understand how debt functions as a moral anesthetic. It allows exploitation to be postponed, disguised, and rationalized. It transforms injustice into accounting and suffering into abstraction. Jefferson did not invent this system, but he perfected its use within his own life. The house on the hill stood not as a monument to independence, but as a reminder of how easily freedom can be articulated while being denied. Monticello's beauty endures, but its silence speaks loudly. Behind every graceful column and measured proportion lies a story of deferred responsibility and accumulated obligation. Jefferson's debts were not merely financial. They were ethical, human, and intergenerational, and they would demand payment, whether he wished to acknowledge them or not. The illusion that Monticello represented continuity, stability, and thoughtful stewardship unraveled most brutally in the years immediately following Jefferson's death. For decades, the wealth system that sustained his life had been built on delayed payment, delayed moral reckoning, delayed collapse. Death ended that delay. What had been manageable as long as Jefferson lived became unforgiving once he was gone. The transition from vision to liquidation exposed the true mechanics of Monticello's economy, revealing that its elegance had always been temporary and its human cost permanent. Jefferson died deeply in debt, far beyond what his estate could absorb. The numbers were staggering by early 19th century standards. Years of borrowing, compounded by interest and declining productivity, left his heirs with obligations that could not be postponed. The legal system that had once protected Jefferson's credit now demanded resolution. Creditors did not care about republican virtue, architectural innovation, or philosophical legacy. They wanted repayment. Monticello, for the first time, had to be valued not as an idea but as inventory. The immediate burden fell on Jefferson's family, particularly his daughter Martha Jefferson Randolph, who inherited responsibility for untangling his affairs. She faced an impossible task. To preserve Monticello intact would have required funds that did not exist. The land alone could not cover the debt. The house itself was costly to maintain and difficult to sell at full value. That left the most liquid assets the estate possessed, enslaved people. The system Jefferson had relied upon now turned openly transactional, stripping away the paternalistic language that had softened its brutality. The sale of enslaved people from Monticello was not a single event but a process of fragmentation. Families who had lived together for generations were divided based on market demand rather than kinship. Skilled workers, young adults, and children fetched the highest prices. Older individuals, less immediately profitable, were often sold last or in less favorable conditions. These sales were conducted with legal precision, recorded carefully, and justified as necessity. Yet necessity itself was the product of decades of choice. For the enslaved community, Jefferson's death marked not liberation, but escalation of vulnerability. Whatever limited stability they had known under a single owner vanished. The familiar routines of Monticello, however exploitative, gave way to uncertainty. People were sold to distant plantations, some to the deep south, where labor conditions were harsher and family separation more permanent. The hilltop house that had once loomed as a symbol of authority now receded into memory as a place they would never see again. This moment shattered the myth that Jefferson's relationship with slavery was somehow more benign than that of his peers. In death, his estate behaved exactly as any other indebted plantation would. Ideals offered no protection. Proximity offered no mercy. Long service offered no security. The people who had built Monticello maintained it, and sustained Jefferson's life were converted into cash to settle accounts. The logic of the market prevailed, as it always had. The dispersal of Monticello's enslaved population also exposed the limits of Jefferson's imagined gradual emancipation. He had postponed action under the belief that time would resolve slavery's contradictions. Instead, time intensified them. His refusal to free enslaved people during his lifetime ensured that their fate would be decided by strangers after his death. What he framed as caution became in practice abandonment. The sale of Monticello itself followed a similar pattern. The house Jefferson had designed so meticulously could not find a buyer willing to preserve it as a residence. Its costs outweighed its immediate value. Eventually, it passed through multiple owners, each treating it less as a home and more as a commodity. The symbolic heart of Jefferson's vision entered a period of neglect, its meaning stripped of context while its debts echoed on. For Jefferson's family, the aftermath was defined by loss rather than inheritance. His descendants did not receive wealth. They inherited obligation. The prestige of his name offered little practical relief. They watched as the estate dissolved piece by piece under pressures they could not control. The grandeur that Jefferson had worked so hard to maintain proved fragile, sustained only by systems that could not survive scrutiny once their architect was gone. This unraveling forces a reconsideration of how legacy is constructed. Jefferson is remembered for words, eloquent declarations, philosophical arguments, revolutionary ideals. Monticello reveals the infrastructure that made those words possible. It shows how ideals can be subsidized by injustice, how brilliance can coexist with exploitation, and how reputation can obscure responsibility. Legacy in this sense is not what one proclaims, but what one leaves behind. The human legacy of Monticello's wealth system did not end with the sales. Trauma carried forward through generations. Families separated at auction lost contact permanently. Children grew up without parents. Skills developed at Monticello were repurposed for the profit of others. The pain inflicted by these transactions was not recorded in Jefferson's papers, but it shaped lives just as decisively as his architectural drawings shaped stone. In later years, narratives of Jefferson softened this ending. He was portrayed as tragic, conflicted, trapped by his time. While there is truth in that framing, it risks obscuring agency. Jefferson made choices consistently, prioritizing vision over sustainability, status over justice, deferral over reform. The collapse of Monticello was not an accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a system designed to protect one man's ideals at the expense of many lives. The forgotten wealth of Monticello, then, is not measured only in labor extracted or debts accumulated. It is measured in the silence that followed, in the absence of the people who once animated the estate. When visitors walk Monticello today, they encounter restored rooms, curated exhibits, and carefully framed history. What is harder to see is the community that was erased to settle a balance sheet. Jefferson imagined Monticello as a gift to the future, a model of enlightened living. Instead, it became a warning. It demonstrates how easily beauty can be built on injustice, how ideals can be financed by suffering, and how postponing moral responsibility does not eliminate it, it transfers it. The wealth system that Jefferson forgot or chose not to confront ensured that his vision could survive his lifetime. It could not survive his death. In the end, Monticello stands not as proof of Republican virtue, but as evidence of its limits. It reveals the cost of separating belief from action, of trusting that history will correct what individuals refuse to address. Jefferson's words endure. His house endures. But the people whose lives paid for both were scattered, sold, and silenced. That is the inheritance Monticello left behind, and the truth its grandeur can no longer conceal. By the time Monticello entered the modern American imagination, much of its original wealth system had already been buried beneath reverence. The story that survived was cleaner, safer, and far more comfortable than the reality. Jefferson was elevated into a symbol, Monticello into a shrine. What disappeared in this transformation was not evidence but emphasis. The mechanisms that sustained the estate, forced labor, debt, family separation, were not denied outright. They were simply minimized, reframed as background noise to greatness. In this silence, a second system emerged, one just as powerful as the first, the system of memory. Throughout the 19th century, Jefferson's legacy was curated by admirers who saw in him the intellectual father of the nation. His writings were republished, his political philosophy celebrated, and his contradictions softened into tragic footnotes. Monticello became a site of pilgrimage, not interrogation. Visitors came seeking inspiration, not accountability. The house was admired for its design, its harmony, its reflection of Jefferson's mind. The lives that made that harmony possible were rarely centered. Memory itself became selective, preserving brilliance while discarding cost. This process was not accidental. The early United States needed heroes, particularly as the nation struggled to define itself after Revolution and Civil War. Jefferson's ideals offered cohesion. To interrogate the full truth of Monticello would have complicated that narrative. Slavery, when mentioned, was framed as an inherited problem Jefferson regretted, but could not solve. Debt was portrayed as misfortune rather than consequence. The wealth system beneath Monticello was treated as an unfortunate context rather than an active choice. In this way, Jefferson was preserved not as a man, but as a myth. The physical restoration of Monticello reflected this same instinct. As preservation efforts began, focus centered on architecture and intellect. Rooms were reconstructed to reflect Jefferson's taste. Gardens were replanted to evoke his vision. Inventions were highlighted as evidence of genius. What was harder to restore intentionally so were the sounds, movements, and lives of the enslaved community. Mulberry Row, once the industrial spine of the plantation, faded into the background of tours and textbooks. The house was remembered. The system was not. This erasure had consequences. By disconnecting Monticello's beauty from its labor, the story reinforced a dangerous idea that great achievements can be evaluated separately from the means that produce them. Jefferson's philosophy was treated as independent of his plantation economy, as though ideas emerge untouched by material reality. This separation allowed admiration to continue without discomfort. It allowed visitors to stand in Jefferson's study without standing in the shoes of those who built it, for descendants of the enslaved. This version of history was not merely incomplete, it was violent in its omission. Generations carried memories passed down orally, memories that contradicted the official narrative. These stories spoke of endurance, exploitation, skill, and loss. They spoke of families who lived in the shadow of the great house, whose lives were shaped by decisions made in rooms they were rarely allowed to enter. For much of American history, these voices were excluded from public interpretation. Deemed secondary to the legacy of a founding father, the silence surrounding Monticello's wealth system mirrored a broader national pattern. Slavery was often acknowledged abstractly while its mechanics were ignored. Plantations were romanticized. Enslavers were humanized. Enslaved people were anonymized. This imbalance shaped how Americans understood not only the past, but inequality in the present. If wealth appeared detached from exploitation, then its concentration seemed natural. Monticello became a case study in how selective memory reinforces power. Over time, however, this curated narrative began to fracture. Scholarship deepened. Archaeology uncovered material evidence of enslaved life. Descendant communities demanded recognition. Historians began to read Jefferson's meticulous records not only as evidence of intellect, but as documentation of control. Slowly, the forgotten wealth system resurfaced, challenging the comfort of long-held interpretations. Monticello could no longer be explained solely as a house of ideas. It had to be understood as a site of extraction. This shift did not diminish Jefferson's importance, but it complicated it. He emerged not as a contradiction to be excused, but as a representative figure, someone whose brilliance and blindness coexisted, reinforced by systems larger than himself. Monticello became a lens through which to examine how ideals are often sustained by injustice, and how memory works to protect those ideals from scrutiny. The discomfort this produced was not a flaw in the narrative. It was its corrective. Public history began to change accordingly. Interpretations expanded. Enslaved individuals were named, their skills acknowledged, their families traced. Mulberry Row regained its centrality. The house was no longer presented as floating above its foundation, but as resting squarely upon it. Visitors were invited to confront the full scope of Monticello's operation, not to assign simple judgment, but to understand complexity honestly. Yet even this reckoning has limits. Memory remains contested. There is still resistance to narratives that center exploitation alongside achievement. For some, acknowledging Monticello's wealth system feels like an attack on national identity. For others, it is a necessary step toward truth. This tension reflects the enduring power of Jefferson's myth and the difficulty of dismantling stories that have shaped collective pride. What Monticello ultimately reveals is that history is not only about what happened, but about what is remembered and why. The forgotten wealth system was never truly forgotten by those who lived under it. It was forgotten by those who benefited from its erasure. Restoring it to the narrative does not rewrite history. It completes it. It forces a reckoning with the fact that American ideals were articulated in spaces built by unfree hands, financed by coerced labor, and preserved through selective remembrance. To walk Monticello today is to stand at the intersection of these truths. The house still inspires. Jefferson's words still resonate. But the silence has been broken. The wealth system that sustained his vision is no longer invisible. It demands acknowledgement not as a footnote, but as a central chapter. In doing so, Monticello ceases to be merely a monument to genius. It becomes a mirror reflecting the cost of separating greatness from responsibility, and the danger of allowing memory to serve comfort instead of truth. Monticello's forgotten wealth system does not belong solely to the 18th or 19th century. Its logic did not vanish with the end of slavery or the sale of Jefferson's estate. What survived was the structure, the way wealth, power, and morality were separated and then reconciled through narrative. Jefferson's world feels distant, but the mechanisms he relied upon remain familiar. Monticello is unsettling not because it was unique, but because it was exemplary. It shows how refined ideals can coexist with exploitation when systems are designed to hide their consequences. At the core of Monticello's operation was a belief that intelligence and intention could absolve harm. Jefferson believed himself enlightened, progressive, forward-looking. That belief allowed him to tolerate contradictions he would have condemned in others. This pattern repeats throughout history. Those who benefit most from unjust systems often see themselves as exceptions, thoughtful participants trapped by circumstance, rather than active agents. Monticello teaches how easily self-perception becomes moral insulation. The Plantation also exposes how inequality sustains itself through normalization. Enslaved labor at Monticello was not framed as cruelty but as order. Debt was not framed as failure but as strategy. Family separation was not framed as violence but as transaction. Language mattered. It softened reality, allowing exploitation to proceed without confronting its human cost. Once normalized, injustice no longer requires constant justification. It simply operates. That is the quiet power of systems like Monticello's. This normalization extended beyond Jefferson's lifetime. After slavery formally ended, similar patterns reappeared under different names. Sharecropping replaced bondage with dependency. Debt peonage replaced ownership with obligation. Legal freedom existed alongside economic coercion. The wealth extracted during slavery did not evaporate. It was reinvested, inherited, and institutionalized. Monticello's story helps explain Why inequality persisted even after the systems that created it were declared over. The lesson is not that Jefferson was uniquely flawed, but that moral contradiction scales easily when systems reward it. Monticello functioned because it delivered results, status, comfort, intellectual space, while deferring accountability. As long as the benefits flowed upward and the costs flowed downward, the system appeared successful. Modern economies operate on similar principles. When labor is distant, abstracted, or outsourced, its suffering becomes easier to ignore. Monticello reminds us that distance is not accidental. It is engineered. The architecture of Monticello itself reinforces this truth. The separation between the main house and Mulberry Row was physical, visual, and psychological. Beauty was elevated. Labor was buried. Modern systems replicate this separation through supply chains, algorithms, and financial instruments. Consumption remains visible. Production disappears. Responsibility dissolves. Jefferson could admire his home without seeing the full cost of maintaining it. Today, many live similarly, benefiting from systems whose consequences are intentionally obscured. Monticello also challenges the idea that good intentions naturally lead to just outcomes. Jefferson believed slavery was wrong in theory, yet wrongness did not prevent participation. Belief did not translate into sacrifice. Change would have required Jefferson to give up comfort, status, and control. He chose not to. This gap between belief and action is one of the most enduring human failures. Monticello shows how easily moral clarity collapses when it threatens personal loss. The Plantation further demonstrates how legacy is shaped less by action than by narrative control. Jefferson's words survived more cleanly than his deeds because they were easier to preserve. Text can be separated from context. Architecture can be admired without interrogating labor. Monticello became a monument not because it told the full truth, but because it told a usable one. This raises uncomfortable questions about how history selects its heroes and what is required to maintain their status. For generations, Americans were taught to see Monticello as proof of enlightenment triumphing over tyranny. Only recently has the conversation expanded to include the people whose lives made that triumph possible. This shift reflects a broader reckoning with how nations remember themselves. Myths simplify, truth complicates. Monticello's story suggests that maturity, both individual and national, begins with the willingness to hold both achievement and harm in the same frame. There is also a warning embedded in Jefferson's failure to resolve his contradictions. By deferring responsibility, he ensured that resolution would come in harsher forms. The sale of enslaved people after his death was not an anomaly. It was the delayed consequence of decades of avoidance. Systems that refuse correction eventually collapse or externalize their costs violently. Monticello's end illustrates how moral debt, like financial debt, compounds over time. This warning extends beyond history. When societies tolerate inequality, because reform seems inconvenient or destabilizing, they repeat Jefferson's mistake. The hope that time will solve injustice without sacrifice is a comforting illusion. Monticello proves that time does not heal systemic harm, it entrenches it. Delay benefits those already protected by the system and punishes those trapped within it. Yet Monticello is not only a story of failure, it is also a site of recovered humanity. The descendants of those enslaved there have reclaimed names, stories, and dignity once erased. Archaeological findings and historical research have restored presence to people long reduced to numbers. This recovery does not undo the harm, but it challenges the silence that allowed it to persist. Memory, once corrected, becomes a form of justice. In this sense, Monticello's meaning continues to evolve. It is no longer just Jefferson's house. It is a record of choices, some visionary, some catastrophic. It invites viewers not to judge from a distance, but to reflect inward. What systems do we rely on that contradict our values? Whose labor supports our comfort? What costs are hidden from view? Monticello does not answer these questions. It demands them. The power of Monticello's story lies in its familiarity. Jefferson was not a monster. He was intelligent, conflicted, and deeply human. That is precisely why his failures matter. They show how injustice persists not only through cruelty, but through compromise. Not only through hatred, but through indifference. Not only through ignorance, but through selective attention. In confronting Monticello's forgotten wealth system, the goal is not to dismantle Jefferson's achievements, but to contextualize them honestly. Admiration without accountability is fragile. It collapses under scrutiny. A fuller truth, though uncomfortable, endures. It allows history to instruct rather than reassure, to warn rather than flatter. Monticello stands today as both artifact and argument. It argues that ideas alone do not liberate. Systems do not dismantle themselves. And memory, if left unchallenged, will protect power before it protects truth. The house on the hill still commands attention, but its meaning has changed. It is no longer only a testament to what one man imagined. It is a reminder of what happens when imagination is allowed to outrun responsibility. Monticello's forgotten wealth system ultimately forces a reckoning not just with Jefferson, but with the foundations of American prosperity itself. The plantation was not an anomaly hidden in the past. It was a prototype. The logic that sustained it: extract labor, concentrate benefit, disguise cost, and sanctify the result through ideals, became deeply embedded in the nation's economic DNA. Monticello offers a rare, intimate view of how that logic formed, and how easily it passed itself down as tradition rather than exploitation. Jefferson believed that land ownership was the key to independence. He imagined a republic of small farmers, each self-sufficient and free. Yet Monticello exposes the limits of that vision. Jefferson's independence depended on the unfreedom of others. His land was productive not because it was worked by autonomous citizens, but because it was worked by people denied choice. This contradiction was not theoretical. It was lived daily, encoded into the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and household labor. The ideal of independence rested on dependency, even as it claimed to reject it. The American economy that emerged from this period inherited these contradictions. Wealth accumulation was celebrated as evidence of virtue and hard work, while the conditions that enabled it were rarely interrogated. Enslaved labor built fortunes that later generations would treat as inherited success. After emancipation, the capital extracted from slavery remained intact, continuing to generate advantage. Monticello illustrates how injustice can be both abolished in law and preserved in outcome. The plantation also reveals how inequality becomes normalized through familiarity. Jefferson lived among enslaved people every day, yet their conditions ceased to shock him. Exploitation became routine, administratively managed, morally muted. This desensitization is one of the most dangerous features of systemic harm. When injustice is stable, it appears natural. Monticello teaches that proximity alone does not produce empathy. Power determines perception. This dynamic extended beyond the plantation into the nation's political culture. Leaders who spoke passionately about liberty often presided over systems that denied it. This was not hypocrisy born of ignorance. It was hypocrisy made possible by structure. Monticello shows how systems can absorb contradiction without collapsing, allowing individuals to maintain moral self-image while perpetuating harm. The American Republic inherited this capacity for compartmentalization. The wealth system at Monticello also clarifies why economic inequality in the United States has proven so resilient. It was not an accident or a deviation. It was a feature built into the earliest models of success. The concentration of land, labor, and credit in the hands of a few created disparities that compounded over generations. Those who benefited from these systems gained education, influence, and security. Those who did not were left with precarity, even after legal freedom was achieved. Jefferson's emphasis on education underscores this imbalance. He championed learning as the foundation of democracy, yet denied education to the very people whose labor sustained his intellectual life. Literacy among enslaved people was discouraged or punished. Knowledge, like wealth, was hoarded. Monticello thus becomes a symbol not just of economic extraction but of intellectual exclusion. The Republic of Minds Jefferson, imagined, was built on enforced ignorance. This exclusion shaped whose stories were told and whose were forgotten. Historical records preserve Jefferson's thoughts in extraordinary detail while erasing the inner lives of those he enslaved. Their voices survived only in fragments, court records, account books, archaeological traces. This imbalance of documentation is itself a form of wealth. Control over narrative became another inheritance passed down alongside land and capital. Monticello reminds us that silence is not absence, but evidence of power. As Americans began to confront these truths, Monticello's meaning shifted again. It became a site of dialogue rather than devotion. The question was no longer whether Jefferson was great, but what his greatness cost. This reframing did not weaken the nation's story. It strengthened it by making it honest. Monticello shows that democracy matures not by preserving comforting myths, but by confronting uncomfortable origins. The Plantation also challenges modern assumptions about progress. It is tempting to view slavery as a moral aberration that was corrected and left behind. Monticello complicates that narrative. It reveals continuity rather than rupture. Systems of control adapted rather than disappeared. Wealth remained concentrated. Opportunity remained unequal. The language changed, but the structure endured. Monticello's lesson is that dismantling injustice requires more than ending its most visible form. There is a moral urgency in this recognition. Jefferson believed history would absolve him. He believed time would solve problems he could not. Monticello demonstrates the danger of that belief. Time did not erase harm. It magnified its consequences. The longer injustice persisted, the deeper its roots grew. The debts, financial, moral, and human, did not vanish. They accumulated interest, yet Monticello also offers a path forward. By recovering the full story, by naming those once reduced to property, by tracing how wealth was built and maintained, history becomes a tool for accountability. Understanding does not equal forgiveness, but it enables responsibility. Monticello's reinterpretation shows how institutions can evolve when confronted with truth rather than protected by reverence. This evolution is not complete, and it remains contested. There are still those who prefer Monticello as monument rather than mirror, but the shift has begun. The forgotten wealth system is being remembered not to assign simple blame, but to reveal patterns that continue to shape the present. Monticello becomes relevant not because it is old, but because its logic persists. In the end, Monticello forces a fundamental question. What does it mean to inherit a nation built on contradiction? Jefferson's vision helped shape American ideals. His wealth system helped shape American inequality. Both are part of the same story. To accept one without the other is to misunderstand both. The house on the hill still stands, carefully preserved, admired, and studied, but its meaning is no longer fixed. It has become a place where ideals and realities collide openly. Monticello no longer asks visitors to simply admire. It asks them to think, to question, and to reckon. In doing so, it transforms from a symbol of finished history into a warning about unfinished work, a reminder that prosperity without justice is fragile, and that the cost of forgetting is always paid by someone else. Monticello's forgotten wealth system ultimately converges on a single, uncomfortable truth. It was sustained not just by structures, but by silence. Silence allowed contradiction to endure without resolution. Silence allowed admiration to outpace accountability. Silence allowed generations to inherit advantage without inheriting responsibility. To understand Monticello fully is to understand how silence operates as a form of power, one that can preserve inequality long after its origins are obscured. Jefferson's silence on the practical realities of slavery at Monticello was deliberate. He wrote extensively about liberty, governance, and human nature, yet rarely described the daily lives of the people he owned. When he did, it was in the language of management rather than humanity. This absence is striking not because Jefferson lacked the capacity for reflection, but because he chose where to apply it. Silence became a tool, allowing him to maintain Intellectual clarity while avoiding moral confrontation, this pattern extended beyond Jefferson himself. Those who curated his legacy also relied on silence. Biographers emphasized achievement. Architects celebrated design. Political historians traced influence. The enslaved community remained peripheral, acknowledged but not centered. This selective storytelling did not require falsification. It required omission. Monticello's wealth system faded from view not because it was hidden, but because attention was redirected elsewhere. Silence also functioned psychologically. For Jefferson, acknowledging the full humanity of the enslaved people at Monticello would have made their exploitation unbearable. To continue, he had to see them as labor, as responsibility, as inheritance, anything but as equals. This emotional distancing was not unique. It is a common mechanism in systems of exploitation. Dehumanization does not always appear as hatred. Often, it appears as avoidance. The power of silence is that it feels passive. It suggests neutrality where none exists. Jefferson did not need to constantly justify slavery. He simply needed not to disrupt it. Over time, what goes unchallenged comes to feel inevitable. Monticello became a place where injustice persisted not through constant violence, but through routine. Work continued. Records were kept. Seasons passed. Silence smoothed the edges of harm. This dynamic did not end with slavery. After emancipation, silence shifted rather than disappeared. The suffering of formerly enslaved people was rarely centered in national narratives of reunion and progress. Economic inequality was explained as failure of character rather than consequence of history. Monticello's wealth system, now dissolved in form, survived in effect. Silence once again protected those who benefited most. The physical preservation of Monticello reinforced this quiet. The house spoke eloquently of intellect and order. Its symmetry suggested reason. Its gardens suggested harmony. These aesthetics encouraged reverence rather than interrogation. Visitors absorbed meaning visually before encountering context. Beauty, in this sense, became a collaborator in forgetting. Monticello did not lie. It distracted. Breaking silence requires discomfort. It requires accepting that admired figures made choices with devastating consequences. It requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that Jefferson articulated powerful ideals and failed to live up to them. For much of American history, this complexity was avoided in favor of simplicity. Monticello's story was flattened into inspiration. The wealth system beneath it was left unexplored. When silence is finally broken, it often meets resistance. To question Monticello feels to some like questioning the nation itself. This reaction reveals how deeply identity is tied to selective memory. Jefferson's image has functioned as reassurance that the nation's founders were wise, moral, and forward-thinking. To complicate that image introduces uncertainty. Monticello threatens not pride but comfort, yet discomfort is not destruction. It is an invitation to maturity. Nations, like individuals, grow by confronting their contradictions rather than denying them. Monticello's wealth system, once acknowledged, does not erase Jefferson's contributions. It contextualizes them. It reminds us that ideas emerge from conditions, and that those conditions matter. Silence also obscured the agency of the enslaved people themselves. By focusing exclusively on Jefferson, history reduced others to background. Their resistance, creativity, skill, and endurance were minimized. Breaking silence restores agency. It reveals that Monticello was not sustained by passive victims, but by people who navigated oppression with intelligence and resilience. Their lives were shaped by constraint, but not defined solely by it. The rediscovery of these stories alters the emotional landscape of Monticello. The house becomes heavier, more complex. Its beauty no longer floats above reality. It presses against it. Visitors are asked not just to admire, but to listen to hear what was once excluded. This listening transforms Monticello from a shrine into a conversation. Silence, once broken, cannot easily be restored. Evidence accumulates. Stories connect. Patterns emerge. Monticello's wealth system, once seen as an unfortunate footnote, reveals itself as central. It explains not only Jefferson's life but the endurance of inequality in a nation founded on equality's promise. The past stops being distant. It becomes explanatory. This recognition also reframes responsibility. Jefferson's failure was not that he lived in an unjust system, but that he helped sustain it while possessing the language to challenge it. Monticello shows how knowledge without action becomes complicity. Silence in this context is not innocence. It is participation. The lesson extends beyond Jefferson. Every era produces its own Monticello's, places where ideals are celebrated while costs are hidden. Silence allows these contradictions to persist. It shields beneficiaries from reckoning. Monticello warns that the absence of conflict in historical narratives is often a sign of unresolved injustice, not harmony. In confronting Monticello's forgotten wealth system, the most radical act is not condemnation but attention. To notice what was once ignored. To name what was once abstract. To understand how silence operates and who it protects. This attention does not change the past, but it reshapes the future by refusing to inherit amnesia. Monticello endures not because it is perfect, but because it is revealing. Its walls contain both brilliance and blindness. Its history contains both aspiration and exploitation. Breaking the silence around its wealth system allows those truths to coexist honestly. And in that coexistence lies the possibility of learning about Jefferson, about America, and about the quiet power of forgetting. In the end, Monticello forces a question that cannot be answered by architecture, documents, or even confession. It asks what a nation chooses to remember and what it allows itself to forget. The house still stands because America decided it mattered. It was preserved, restored, studied, and celebrated. But preservation is never neutral. Every act of saving one story risks burying another. Monticello survived not only because of Jefferson's genius, but because the country needed a physical place where its founding ideals could feel solid and reassuring. The cost of that reassurance was distance from the labor that built it, from the suffering that sustained it, and from the contradictions that made it possible. What Monticello ultimately reveals is that wealth does not disappear when systems collapse. It transforms. The enslaved labor that once generated Jefferson's comfort did not simply vanish with emancipation. Its effects echoed forward through land ownership, education, political power, and inherited security. The wealth extracted from enslaved lives helped shape families, institutions, and regions that continued to benefit long after the original injustice was declared illegal. Monticello was not an isolated moral failure. It was a node in a much larger network of accumulation that defined early American prosperity. Jefferson died deeply in debt, a fact often cited as evidence that slavery did not ultimately enrich him. But this framing misses the point. Debt does not negate exploitation. Monticello's wealth system was inefficient because it prioritized status and consumption over sustainability. Jefferson lived beyond his means not because slavery failed to generate value, but because it encouraged a lifestyle detached from accountability. The system absorbed human cost while shielding its beneficiaries from immediate consequence. Even in financial failure, Jefferson remained protected by reputation, family connections, and historical importance. The enslaved people did not die after Jefferson's death. Monticello itself was sold. Its contents dispersed, its enslaved community broken apart. Families were separated not by ideology, but by auction prices. This moment is often treated as an epilogue, a sad but inevitable decline. In reality, it was the final transaction in Monticello's wealth system. When the land could no longer sustain Jefferson's vision, human lives were converted into cash one last time. The system closed, but it did not repent. For generations, Americans encountered Monticello without encountering that ending. The house was reassembled as a cultural artifact, not a moral one. Restoration focused on appearance, not consequence. The narrative stopped at Jefferson's brilliance and resumed at national reverence. The space between the human wreckage left behind was minimized. This selective memory shaped how Americans understood not just Monticello, but slavery itself. It became something that happened back then, detached from modern structures of advantage. Today, that distance is narrowing. Archaeology, scholarship, and descendant testimony have begun to reinsert the missing lives into Monticello's story. Names once buried in ledgers now surface in exhibitions. Workspaces once ignored are now interpreted. This shift is not about tearing monuments down. It is about making them honest. Monticello does not lose meaning when its full history is told. It gains weight. Yet honesty has limits when it stops at acknowledgement. Monticello can educate without transforming. Visitors can learn about slavery, feel sadness, and still leave unchanged. The deeper challenge lies in recognizing how Monticello's wealth system resembles systems that still exist. The mechanisms are familiar: invisible labor, moral outsourcing, comfort built on distance. The lesson is not confined to the 18th century. It persists wherever prosperity is disconnected from responsibility. Monticello also challenges the idea that progress naturally resolves contradiction. Jefferson believed slavery would fade away on its own, dissolved by time and reason. It did not. It required conflict, sacrifice, and law to dismantle, and even then its after-effects endured. The belief that injustice will correct itself is one of Monticello's most dangerous inheritances. It allows those in power to wait instead of act, to hope instead of change. The house stands today as both achievement and warning. Its elegance shows what human imagination can create. Its foundations show what human denial can excuse. Monticello is not valuable because it offers answers, but because it refuses to let the question disappear. How does a society reconcile ideals with actions? How much harm can be hidden behind beauty before it becomes tradition? For the descendants of the enslaved community, Monticello is not abstract history. It is personal geography. It is where ancestors lived, worked, loved, resisted, and endured. Recognition does not restore what was taken, but it challenges the erasure that compounded the harm. When their stories are told alongside Jefferson's, Monticello becomes less about ownership and more about witness. The American story often frames itself as a steady march toward justice, punctuated by mistakes that are eventually corrected. Monticello complicates that arc. It shows how injustice can coexist with brilliance, how exploitation can fund enlightenment, and how systems can be morally sophisticated while remaining profoundly cruel. This complexity is uncomfortable, but it is also mature. It resists the temptation to simplify history into heroes and villains. Monticello's forgotten wealth system matters because it reveals a pattern that extends far beyond one man or one house. It shows how inequality is normalized through routine, how silence becomes policy, and how admiration can anesthetize conscience. These dynamics did not end with slavery. They adapted, refined, and reappeared in new forms. Monticello is an origin point, not an exception. To stand at Monticello today is to stand inside a contradiction that never fully resolved. The view is still beautiful. The house still feels serene. But beneath that calm lies a truth that cannot be landscaped away. Wealth was created here through coercion. Ideals were articulated here without being applied universally. A nation learned to celebrate one while ignoring the other. What we do with that knowledge is the final test of Monticello's relevance. We can treat it as a cautionary tale safely contained in the past. Or we can recognize it as a mirror, reflecting how easily systems of inequality hide behind culture, intellect, and tradition. Monticello does not demand guilt. It demands awareness. The dark secret of Monticello's wealth system is not that it existed. It is that it worked so well for so long with so little challenge. It reminds us that injustice rarely survives through force alone. It survives through acceptance, habit, and silence. And it ends only when those are withdrawn. The house will remain on its hill. The bricks will endure. But the story is no longer fixed. Each generation decides what Monticello represents. A monument to genius alone, or a complete record of how a nation was built. The difference between those two versions is not academic. It shapes how we understand power, responsibility, and the true cost of prosperity. Monticello endures because America keeps returning to it, searching for itself. What it finds there depends on how willing it is to look beneath the surface. The wealth system is no longer forgotten. The question now is whether its lesson will be.